Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. Feel free to continue introducing yourself in the chat with your name, your pronouns, and where you are joining from today. And welcome to our webinar, which is called Let's Talk About Apartheid. We really appreciate everyone who has shown up here today in the spirit of learning and justice. And we're going to get right into our program. But first, we have a few introductions, and we want to set up some expectations before we begin with our speakers. So my name is Jay. I use they or he pronouns. I was born and raised in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I'm now based in Los Angeles, where I organize with IfNotNow. And I'll hand it off to Maya.
Hi, everyone. Wonderful to see you all from all over the globe. My name is Maya. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently based in Cape Town, South Africa. And I've been organizing with South African Jews for Free Palestine, or SAJFP, since about 2018.
And I also want to introduce our tech team who is here today, which consists of Noah, Seth, Sylvia, and Wilson. You'll see them in the chat with tech support next to their name. And please feel free to reach out to one of them if you are having difficulties with Zoom today.
So today we will be hearing from three brilliant speakers, Father Peter John Pearson, Stephen Friedman, and Deanna Othman, who we will introduce shortly. We just wanted to say that while the goal of this event is towards deeper shared learning and connecting us all to ways to get involved, we are going to be talking about some difficult realities. We will hear about painful, violent experiences. And so we may hear things that challenge the way we see ourselves. We want to acknowledge that this may be difficult, but we believe that this is important and necessary work to understanding injustice in our world and how we can work towards justice and freedom for all.
So in order to make this a safe space for this challenging work, we have a few community guidelines that we'd like to set up before we begin. So by being here in this virtual space today, we're asking that everyone agree not to partake in any of the following behaviors that include trolling or cyberbullying, attacking or provoking other individuals, spamming the chat or using the chat for purposes other than what is intended, and sharing content from the space elsewhere with malicious intent. And we're also asking that in this space, we all assume best intentions while prioritizing impact over intent. We ask questions and listen carefully in order to move through conflict, especially when we disagree. We are respectful of differing opinions, viewpoints, and experiences. We recognize how our identities and experiences shape our vantage points. We work to mitigate unequal and oppressive power dynamics in order to build a movement co-led by Jews who have historically been marginalized. And we consider what is best for the movement, not just for ourselves as individuals.
We also want to introduce the two groups organizing this event. And at the end of the webinar, we will talk about ways that you can stay updated about our future events and how you can get more involved. So South African Jews for Free Palestine is an organization of South African Jews working towards a just and peaceful end to the conflict in historic Palestine.
And IfNotNow is a movement of American Jews organizing our community to end US support for Israel's apartheid system and demand equality, justice, and a thriving future for all Palestinians and Israelis. So as we get started, we want to acknowledge that these are not easy times. In addition to the devastation in Gaza, many of us in the US have watched the past week as student protests in our own cities have been met with a militarized response, and in some cases, attacks by counter-protesters. My own alma mater, USC, endorsed the arrest of over 90 students and community members, among a nationwide total of 2,000 people who have been arrested protesting for divestment. And this mirrors college campus protests in the 1980s calling for divestment from apartheid South Africa, which makes a discussion about the parallels between the two anti-apartheid movements more timely than ever. But I also want to acknowledge, again, that these are not easy topics to be dealing with. And I want to say I really appreciate people that are coming to this with anxiety or uncertainty. So in order to make sure that everyone feels present and able to absorb what they're hearing today, we're going to do some grounding work. And to guide us in that, I am really grateful to introduce Amy Kessler, who is a certified coach and mind-body therapy practitioner and one of our IfNotNow movement chaplains. So I'm going to hand it off to Amy for this next portion.
Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see you all here today. So I'm inviting you to do a short grounding practice with me before the webinar begins. So if you want to, find a comfortable seat, and let's just take a few minutes to slow down, reconnect to our bodies, and the ground, the earth. So if you're sitting on a chair, plant your feet flat on the ground, pushing gently. You might lay down on the ground if that feels good. Just notice the contact of your body on what's supporting you. If you want to, all right. So when you're ready, once you're comfortable, close your eyes or gaze softly at the ground in front of you. And take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. And one more time, a deep breath in, a slightly deeper breath out, grounding into the floor or your seat. And get curious about how your body feels. Is it heavy or light? Still or fidgety? Solid or fluid? Warm or cool? Just be present with the body. Seated on your chair or cushion, in touch with the ground, connected to your breath. And can you welcome whatever is coming up for you? And with eyes closed, I'd like you to ground into what brought you here today. What's important to you? What do you care about? You might notice a thought, a physical sensation, an emotion. It might be very clear or quite vague. That's okay. Just notice. A deep breath in, a deeper breath out. You might make some noise on the exhale, letting go of whatever is not serving you today. And from this place of stability and connection, you can gently open your eyes. So just to let you know that if you do feel activated now or during the talk, you can always take a breath and ground. You can look around the room and focus on something that brings you a sense of steadiness or calm. It's a reminder that, we always have a choice to engage or take a break. And my challenge today, and I hope that you'll join me, is to see if I can stay grounded in my breath and my body, and also listen deeply to the conversation on the topic of apartheid. So can I practice doing both at the same time? And now you might open your eyes. Just take another deep breath and open your eyes. And as we start connecting with the panelists and with others in the room. Okay. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Amy, we really appreciate your grounding moment, and I hope that helped for everyone to be as focused and grounded as possible. So our first speaker is Father Peter John Pearson. He is a priest in the Archdiocese of Cape Town and is the director of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, which is the formal arm of the Catholic Church's engagement with issues of policy and legislation at the national level. He has a long involvement in various struggles to do with fighting injustice and has been engaged in advocacy with regard to the Palestinian situation for a long time. He also works in areas of justice for migrants and in the extractive industry. So I will now hand over to Father Pearson.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm honored to be part of such an important conversation, bearing in mind, I suppose, that one of the acute shortages in our time and in our world today is that of conversation. We seem to have chosen a road in this terribly conflictual and contested time. We've chosen a road of sound bites and slurs and populist rhetoric that is clearly not helpful in the time we're in and faced with the immense problems we faced with. So to be engaged in conversation is really something enormously powerful, and I'm delighted and honored and challenged to be part of this. Thank you very much. I am in these last months, particularly since October, I have often thought and pondered on a line that I kept very close to me all through the years of apartheid, all through those struggles, all through the tensions, all through the activism that denoted that time for me. It's that line, and some of you might know it, from Edmund Burke's monumental history of the French Revolution, where he says, there are some things too terrible to speak about, and yet too important to be silent about. And I think that that obligation to speak and to break silences is one of the key was one of the key driving forces to dismantling apartheid. And I am quite sure that when we're speaking apartheid in other contexts, that is as important. The South African apartheid experience was, I suppose, what you made of it, what you thought of it. It was different for all sorts of different people. For the beneficiaries of the system, it was one thing. For those who were victimized, it was quite another. For those of one class, it was another experience, and to those of a different class. And so it was a multifaceted reality. But I think whatever the reality was, the construct, the architecture around it was that there were three very clear things. And I think they reflected in different ways in many of the international protocols, in many of the UN definitions. It was essentially about discriminatory practices, which some people now have the gall to speak of as banal practices of apartheid, which of course it wasn't if you were having to carry that in your lives, if it was part of who you were and what you experienced in that time. It was anything but banal, and so it's really quite minimizing to now call it banal. But there were those practices of discrimination, those practices which were profound in many ways and shaped people's lives in every way, but were there at the service of structures and hierarchies of power. The apartheid discrimination, the segregation that was rigorously enforced in every sphere of life, from where you could be born to where you could be buried, the discrimination and segregation followed you throughout. There was no respite from it. But it was, and that's how some people defined it. But a closer reading and a very obvious reading, maybe even too obvious to state, but it is that was there in the service of power. It was there in the service of a minority group maintaining hierarchies of power, especially economic power, maintaining the access to privileged support systems. And that was at the heart of apartheid. And so in interrogating the notion of apartheid, it is about examining the manifestations of segregation and discrimination and linking it to the deeper root cause of apartheid, which was the maintenance of these hierarchies of power, especially of economic power. The second thing that almost all of them underline quite significantly is that the maintenance of power had strong militarized support. So the seeming consensus, the seeming passiveness of those who were at the receiving end of apartheid looked like that because it was held and supported by a large militarization, by army, police, and every form, so that we had the situation which is so well known and captured in so many iconic pictures of police coming in, shooting, killing, the famous Hector Peterson picture of the 16th of June of a woman carrying her shot brother, mortally shot brother, in her arms, and terribly moving, almost a Pieta kind of picture. But that kind of military, violent support of the system was necessary to quell any kind of dissension. And so apartheid was the discrimination that was important in order to, for instance, get people working in mines and in agriculture and in domestic service through a tax system. Then it was a reality based and embedded in violent practice. And the third aspect I want to underline is that it was a deliberate dislocation of any kind of social cohesion. So any form of social cohesion, any form of developing agency amongst the oppressed was deliberately targeted for disaggregation. And so we, not only was all this discrimination happening, but anything like solidarity within the groups who were discriminated against, anything around developing agency so that one was able to sharpen resistance, which was always there, often in very crude, but often also very effective forms, anything that allowed that or that any possibility of that emerging as a strength and as a force to be reckoned with against the kind of hegemony of apartheid was very quickly dealt with. So there was a dislocation of any kind of social cohesion and therefore of any support for developing agency. And it was quite by exception in various times that leadership arose despite that. But curiously now, in looking back, in contesting that situation and the history, one also finds that below the surface, often very invisible as a form of both survival and resistance, a contrary flow also developed, a flow of resistance, a flow of strategic participation in the battles to get rid of apartheid. So my starting point tonight, it's also my ending point, but my point tonight maybe is that it is discrimination, but we sell the concept short. We sell it seriously short if we only see it as discrimination. That is only the external manifestation of profoundly embedded power hierarchies that were meant to benefit a small group, an elite. Secondly, it was the use and the militarization of our society, the unfettered use of military and of violence, the impunity with which the powerful acted, that defined so many aspects of life. And it was the constant attempt to dislocate social cohesion and the agency that is allowed to develop in that kind of social solidarity and social context that was constantly attacked. I think it is also important to add as a rider to this that all of those powerful realities that seemed totally in place, that seemed totally kind of immutable, eventually fell. And it's a salutary lesson, I think, always to remind ourselves that all forms of oppression ultimately fall. They cannot, and we know this through history, they cannot sustain themselves, and they fall. What replaces them might be similar, might be very different, it might be seasonal, but they fall and they offer us another opportunity to reimagine, to rebuild, and to shape a more just world. So they do fall. I think the other lesson that we take out of the apartheid struggle is that despite the total attempts to paralyze any kind of agency or disaggregate any kind of social cohesion, there remains a deeper substratum of resilience that emerges, and people find ways of not merely surviving. They find ways of strategizing to bring that to an end. And as I think back, I remember all sorts of groups, from sports clubs to youth groups to faith groups, to women's groups in South Africa, which were very powerful, that were able to hold what I think theologians called dangerous memories, who were able to hold those dreams, those memories of an earlier time, the memories that are embedded in history, the rituals that are passed down, and to use those to continue to retell stories and to offer hope. And so while the external situation might seem completely ranged against one, there was a space, often a subterranean, to put it that way, space where other consciously and purposeful strategies were employed to keep another vision of hope alive. And at the right time, the confluence of events, those dangerous memories that people hold of who they are and their nobility and their ancestor stories come to birth in a new and in a life-giving way. So I say that so that against the backdrop of the carnage that is happening now, against the backdrop of the pain that has been seared into so many people's lives, against the backdrop of the solidarity that's been thwarted in many areas, we remember that one of the lessons that emerged after the long night of apartheid was that the dawn eventually broke. And the purposeful work of people over the decades, underground, in surreptitious ways, in often under facades of different kinds, actually came together as a force of incredible goodwill and was able to offer the country a new possibility of birth. What has happened subsequently is another story for another day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Pearson. And we do have one question for you before we move on to the next speaker. And the question is, why do so many people deny that apartheid is happening in Palestine today?
I think because they hear a voice that comes from the perpetrators who define the content of those definitions. And so without the backdrop of history, without conscious and purposeful analytical work, it becomes easy to say that is not apartheid. But I think just even in terms of the three broad categories that I offered, it must be pretty obvious to all who have an openness to looking at the question to see that it is. But I think we also carry in ourselves the need for self-preservation, a false way of trying to maintain dignity by not being regarded as a pariah state. And we think by denying what we are doing, we can withhold and sustain our dignity, but also the privileges and those hierarchies of power of which we are the beneficiaries. But it has such a bad name that no one wanted to be seen by it. But in fact, if the content is there, if the definitions are there, then it is that, no matter who tries to call it otherwise.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your words and time with us today. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, who is Stephen Friedman. Stephen Friedman is a research professor associated with the Department of Philosophy and the Humanities faculty at the University of Johannesburg. He's a political scientist who specializes in the study of democracy. He is a public commentator, a newspaper columnist, and a former trade unionist. So without further ado, Stephen Friedman.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It is a privilege, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. My brief, as I understand it, is to talk about a book which I wrote, which was published a few months ago, which I think is relevant to the topic. But I also want to use the argument in the book as a springboard for saying a couple of things about where I think we are at the moment and where we might start thinking about alternatives to the reality we're forced to live with at the moment. So let me start with the book, which is called Good Jew, Bad Jew, and it was inspired originally by something which I think most people on the call will be familiar with. And if you're in the US and you've been either participating in or following the very courageous attempts on campuses to challenge a genocide and to challenge the oppression which is being visited on people, which is this very odd phenomenon in which people who are opposing a discriminatory system, opposing a racist system, to be blunt and honest, are themselves accused of being racist. And I'm thinking, of course, obviously, particularly, of course, of the allegation that people who have been criticizing the Israeli state, supporting Palestinian rights, are anti-Semitic. And I'd been doing quite a bit of reading on this, and it became apparent that this was a very widespread phenomenon. And what was also quite peculiar about the phenomenon is that many of the people, in some cases, most of the people who were accused of being anti-Semitic were themselves Jewish, which was a little bit odd. I mean, the British Labour Party, which I discussed at some length, which conducted a McCarthyite witch hunt against people who were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. One of the Jewish groups within the Labour Party calculated that if you were a Jewish member of the Labour Party, you were 20 times more likely to be expelled for anti-Semitism than if you were not Jewish. So that was the first peculiarity. And the other peculiarity which needed to be explained is that people who quite clearly were anti-Semitic, in other words, people who harbored racial prejudices about Jews, anti-Jewish racists, that many of them were very good friends of the Israeli state. And I start off the book with a bizarre phenomenon, which I don't know whether Americans noticed, but if you go back to January the 6th, 2021, when Donald Trump's supporters were trying to overturn an election result, some of the participants in that protest were wearing T-shirts which had slogans like 6 million were not enough, or Camp Auschwitz, clearly Nazi slogan, there's no other way to describe it. And at the same time, the same group was waving Israeli flags. And obviously, if one knows the history of anti-Jewish racism, that also seemed a bit odd. And the book is an attempt to explain that, but it goes further than that, because it's also an attempt to understand what Zionism really is and what Zionism isn't. And the two are related. And seeing that we are talking about apartheid this evening, yes, like Father Pearson, I agree that the evidence that the Israeli state is an apartheid state is overwhelming. If there was any serious doubt about this, the nation-state law passed by the Israeli parliament would surely have settled those doubts, because the nation-state law proclaims very proudly that the Israeli state is the state of the Jewish people. And of course, not everybody who lives there is Jewish. And it really would be the equivalent of somebody changing the US Constitution to declare that the US was exclusively the state of white people, and anybody in the US who happened not to be white was simply there as a guest of the people to whom the country rightly belonged. But I think that we need to go further than that, because the impression can sometimes be created that this lurch towards apartheid is somehow a deviation from what the Israeli state's supposed to be. That somehow it started off as a humane idea and things went horribly wrong. And the book argues against that view, but it argues against another view as well. And that is the view that Zionism, which is the ideology which lies behind the Israeli state, that Zionism is an expression of Jewish pride, an expression of Jewish self-determination, that Zionists are people who believe that Jews, that being Jewish is something that you ought to be immensely proud of, and perhaps in the view of some of us are excessively extreme in the way that they impose that on everybody else. But if you look at the history and you look at the origins of Zionism, you discover that the reality is rather different. That in fact, Zionism was built not out of a desire to express your Jewishness. Zionism was born out of a desire to, in effect, renounce Jewishness. Because, and this is all over the Zionist writings in the early period, the Zionists were as nasty about Jews, quite frankly, as the anti-Semites of the time were. The Zionists said, look, the anti-Semites are right, Jews are grubby, Jews are parasites, Jews have nothing to contribute. But where the only difference between them and the anti-Semites at the time is that the anti-Semites said, well, this is the way in which Jews are, because that's the way they're born and that's what they are genetically. And the Zionists said, no, Jews are degraded in this way because they don't have a state. And as soon as they have a state, they will no longer be degraded. And what did it mean to not be degraded? It didn't mean, as you would expect from a nationalist movement trying to express the right of people to express who they really are, to express their genuine identity. It was not that at all. It was a frantic desire, I can't put it any other way, to be white Western Europeans. And that became the motivating force of Zionism. So that, for example, Theodor Herzl, who was one of the early, who was many regard as the most important ideologue of Zionism, the man who started the whole movement, Herzl wrote a novel to express his ideas called Alt-Neuland, Old New Land, in which he painted an obviously rather rosy picture of the Jewish state which would emerge if Zionism was successful. And the peculiar thing about his state is that the inhabitants of the state are fond of getting dressed up in ties and tails and going to the opera. The language they speak is German, and Herzl tells us in the book that the Jewish state should practice dueling. If anybody's unfamiliar with this rather barbaric habit of aristocrats in a previous era of settling their rather petty disputes by trying to shoot each other, that dueling should become part of the state because, and I quote, it adds a sense of French refinement. So whatever you think of the opera and whatever you think of dueling, Herzl's state was quite clearly a white European state implanted on the Middle East, and that was what was considered important about it. One of the chief motivations of Zionism at that particular time which happened in France, was something called the Dreyfus trial. For those who aren't familiar with it, Dreyfus was a Jewish colonel in the French army who was unjustly accused of treason. There was a campaign in his defense. It turned out afterwards that the treason charges were entirely fabricated, precisely because he was Jewish, by people who didn't want a Jew as a captain in the French army. And this was taken by Herzl, Sigmund Freud, who was a very important thinker at the time, who was sympathetic to Zionism, and others, to mean that the Jews could not become white Europeans, because, of course, what Dreyfus had done is, if you like, the sort of quintessential act of identifying with white Europeanness, joining the French army, which at that stage, of course, was engaged in any number of colonial wars against dark people and people who were not European. And the thinking was, well, if Dreyfus, who'd done everything he could be to be a white European, if he was rejected, then something else was needed. And the something else which was needed was not a rejection of white Europeanness, but a state, which was then regarded as the most obvious expression of white Europeanness. And when I use Europeanness, I must stress that I'm talking about of European origin. I'm not talking about Europe only. I mean, certainly America is full of people who would be classified, whose identity would be European in that sense. South Africa is full of people, obviously among the white minority, who would meet that description. Canada, Australia are obviously other examples. And the way in which Zionists felt that Jews ought to become white Western Europeans was in effect to reject what being Jewish had been for centuries. All its varieties. Obviously, one important way in which people had been Jewish for many centuries was in a religious sense, to study Jewish religious texts and to practice the Jewish religion. There were others who rejected religion and identified as Jews with various political movements for greater equality. So that, for example, you had in the Tsarist period in Russia, you had the Yiddish Bund, which was the Jewish association of socialists who joined the Russian Social Democratic Party, which later, of course, split into the Bolshevik and the Menshevik Party. But in other words, joined the socialist movement in Russia. And then, of course, you had a very prominent stream of cultural expressions of Jewish culture from people who were not necessarily religious. And all of that was rejected by Zionism as a sign of weakness, as an indication that Jews were not sufficiently white Western European. And therefore, it first of all explains a lot of what we're seeing at the moment. It explains it because the reason why Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro and Viktor Orban and add whichever right-wing fanatic occurs to you, the reason why they are so fond of the Israeli state, despite the fact that they don't terribly much like Jews, is precisely that they see it as an expression of Europeanness. A bit of evidence which came in after I'd written the book, because it came from another book which has only been published since then, which is a study of German official reactions to Zionism and the Israeli state. Has a very revealing exchange at the beginning. Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of post-Nazi Germany, in an exchange with David Ben-Gurion, who was, of course, the first prime minister of the Israeli state, said to him, "We will always look after you because you are the West's representative in the Middle East, in the Levant, etc. And IfNotNow was simply expressing what has become mainstream policy among Western elites. Not necessarily, of course, among Western citizens, because if it was dominant, if it was the only strain among Western citizens, then we wouldn't be having this discussion this evening. We wouldn't be seeing what we're seeing in the campuses, and we wouldn't be seeing opinion polls which indicate that the majority of Americans reject what is being done in the name of the West to Palestinians. But the point is that the supposed contradiction between liking the Israeli state and disliking Jews is explained by this Westernness. And secondly, the fact that anti-Semitism, which of course traditionally was hatred of Jews, racism directed at Jews, and almost always, which is very important to bear in mind, those people, and there's a chapter on the book on real anti-Semitism, on the tradition of anti-Semitism, those people who harbored hatred against Jews almost invariably harbored the same hatred towards Black people, towards Muslims, towards Chinese people, etc., the whole sort of suite of white supremacist prejudices. That anti-Semitism is no longer that. That in the view of the Israeli state, weaponized by the Israeli state, and in the Western elites who back it, anti-Semitism no longer means hatred of Jews. It means anti-Western. It means critical of the West. And therefore, there's no contradiction in accusing Jews of anti-Semitism, because if they are Jews who are critical of the West, well, then they are quote unquote anti-Semitic, even if they are Jewish, and even if they are, as some of the people I mentioned in the book are, people who are observant Jews in the traditional sense, observing the dietary laws, the Sabbath, etc. And therefore, it's not only that we're dealing with an apartheid state, it's that we're dealing with a state which in effect is perilously close to being anti-Semitic itself, in the sense that it has rejected and despised what it has meant to be Jewish for centuries, and replaced white Westernness as the only acceptable mode of being Jewish. So that is that's a very broad sense of the argument. There is one other aspect of the argument I want to mention before I say a few things about where we are now very briefly. And that is that the book is called Good Jew, Bad Jew, because it was inspired by a book by Mahmoud Mamdani, who's spent most of his academic life teaching either in Uganda or in the US in New York. Mamdani wrote a book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And one of the points that Mamdani made in the book tells you exactly where white Europeanness leads you now. And he makes the point that in the minds of Western elites, there have always been two types of wars. There are civilized wars, and civilized wars are wars between white Europeans. And they are governed by the rules of war, the Geneva Conventions, in effect. And we all know what those are. You don't attack civilians, you don't attack schools, you don't attack hospitals. But he says laws against people who are not white Western Europeans are governed by what he calls the laws of nature. And the law of nature is, in effect, might is right. And you only have to look at what is happening in Palestine today and compare it to reactions to what is happening in Ukraine to recognize how accurate Mamdani's analysis is. Because white Ukrainians are, as they should be, because all human beings should be, white Ukrainians are entitled to the protection of the laws of war. Palestinians are not, because Palestinians are members of a subordinate group. I make the point in the book following Mamdani that although the Nazi slaughter of the Nazi genocide of Jews was regarded by white Western Europeans as something which had simply come out of nothing, many of the methods that Nazis used in order to try to destroy the Jewish people were methods they tried out in Namibia, next door to South Africa, because in Namibia, they had conducted a genocide of the Nama and Herero peoples and had used much the same methods. And one of the strategists of the Nama and the Herero genocide became one of Hitler's confidants who gave him advice on how to foist the same barbarity on the Jews and others in Western Europe. So white Western Europeanness is not a particularly neutral state of being in the way that I'm talking about it as an ideology, as in effect one of the ideologies of white supremacy. It becomes a way of dehumanizing people and in effect insisting that the lives of people of white Western European descent are important and the lives of people who fall into another category are not. So that is what we are witnessing at the moment. And the question becomes, and that in a sense follows on from where Father Pearson left off, is, where is this going now? And I think that despite the horror we see, I agree with him that there is reason for hope. And I wouldn't put it much stronger than that. And the reason for hope is this, that I argued a while ago. I think before I say that there is one point I need to make, stress, which I have made it already, but I want to stress it again. When I talk about this white supremacist prejudice, this Western prejudice, I'm talking about the elites. I'm not talking about people who happen to be born in Western countries. And as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing increasingly that many people in white Western European countries are refusing to accept their elite's definition of whose lives are important and whose lives are not. And that is crucial to where we are at the moment, because I read an article not long after October the 7th, arguing that although the Israeli state was talking about the Israeli state's their 9/11, that actually what we were witnessing was not their 9/11, we were witnessing their Sharpeville. And for those who are not South African and not familiar with it, Sharpeville is a town not far from Johannesburg, where I live, to the south, where in 1960, 69 unarmed people protesting against apartheid laws were mowed down by the South African police, by the guns of the South African police. And Sharpeville, in retrospect, horrific as it was, became a watershed moment in the fight against apartheid. Because up until Sharpeville, what was being perpetrated in South Africa in the name of whiteness did not have terribly great international resonance. It wasn't picked up very. It was in the back of people's minds, etc. Sharpeville put it in front of mind. It had no effect, just to warn our American colleagues of what might lie ahead. Sharpeville had absolutely no effect on the elites in Europe at all. The British government, which was colonizing South Africa at the time, the very year after Sharpeville, agreed that South Africa could become a republic, despite the fact that the referendum, which had endorsed a republic, was participated in by white people only. Black people were excluded entirely. And despite the fact that the British knew perfectly well that the republic they were allowing to exist would be a racist republic which would practice apartheid. So the elites were not interested at all, but many people of goodwill were interested. And it was on the back of Sharpeville that the anti-apartheid movement in Western Europe, in the US, in key parts of the Western world became very salient. And it really colored the way in which people opposed South African apartheid after that. I mean, just to illustrate the point, one of the campaigns, one of the very successful campaigns, because it has resonance in South Africa, was against sports teams that all white sports teams chosen under apartheid should not be allowed to play in international competition. And one of the most powerful posters which was used in the UK particularly was a picture of police brutalizing people in a Sharpeville type situation. And the slogan at the end of the poster was, if you could see their national sport, you wouldn't want to see their cricket. And this way of using the brutality as a lens through which to look at an unjust system became absolutely crucial. And over time, because citizens were mobilized effectively, that became the route to beginning to dismantle apartheid and putting the pressure on which achieved that. And my final thought is that, where does that place those of us, I'm talking about myself, but hopefully most of the people on the call, who would like to encourage that, who would like to encourage a movement towards the kind of democracy and freedom for all, which surely must be the fate of Palestinians and Israelis. And the answer to that from a Jewish perspective, I think, is that there is a tremendous, obviously there are all sorts of political engagements which people need to be engaged in. I think that there is a tremendous need to begin cleansing, that's the only word I can think of, cleansing Jewishness and Judaism of the taint of an ideology which really is hostile to both. So I think that the more we're able to move in a direction, if we are Jewish, in which we are proudly practicing a Jewish identity, which is not racist, which is not violent, which is not militaristic, which recognizes the humanity of every human creature, that would be a very important part of our contribution to what I see as an unfolding political battle to demand humanity for the people of Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Insightful as ever. And just to repeat for everyone that the name of Professor Stephen Friedman's book is Good Jew, Bad Jew, Racism, Anti-Semitism, and the Assault on Meaning. I recommend everyone to go take a look. And encourage you all again to write your questions into the chat. I will now ask Stephen one question, but we will still have questions towards the end of this conversation. For now, Stephen, someone asked in the chat, Zionists have shut down the voices of actual practicing Jews as self-hating. What advice can you offer allies to counter this mislabeling?
Well, it's allies of people who are not Jewish and sympathetic. I think that we need to work with those allies to recapture this Jewish identity. And it's not a case of inventing anything. It's what we've lived with for 2,500 years. And I think that there is I think that both non-Jews and Jews working together can cooperate in reviving a Jewish tradition which really points towards a shared future, towards a democratic future. So, and I think obviously to state the obvious, I think the more people who consider themselves allies are able to familiarize themselves with what Jewish identity really is, rather than what Zionists claim it is, the more we can start to counter this absurd slander that those of us who insist on being Jewish in the traditional way or in some way anti-Semitic or self-hating.
Brilliant. Thanks so much again. I'm sure we'll come back to you with lots of questions towards the end. But I'll now like to introduce Deanna Othman. She is our final speaker. She is a Palestinian American from Oak Lawn. She has a bachelor's degree in English and International Studies and a master's in journalism, both from Northwestern University. Ms. Othman is both a journalist and educator. She currently teaches high school English, as well as a course on media and culture at Universal School. She has had a religion column on the Huffington Post and also has been published in the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, Salon.com, The New Arab, and many other outlets. She also served as the assistant editor of Islamic Horizons magazine. Ms. Othman has served on the board of AMP Chicago for 13 years and has also served on the board of CIO-CG. She's from the West Bank, but has traveled to Gaza twice, most recently in June 2023. So I'll now hand over to Ms. Deanna Othman.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I think that I kind of have the perfect segue after the last speaker to talk a little bit about the role that media plays in all of this, specifically in justifying some of the policies and elements that Professor Friedman talked about regarding, the laws of war versus like the laws of nature, and how this applies to what's currently happening in Palestine right now. I think one of the things that we kind of need to think about in relation to the dehumanization of Palestinians and how this plays into the acceptance of what's happening, even though here in the United States, we are facing a lot of support from various communities and allies who are standing with Palestinians. Largely, the narrative in media has been to vilify Palestinians, and this is not something that is new. This is something very deep-seated and something that, goes back decades and is, intertwined with the portrayal of Muslims as well. So I think we kind of have to, think about this in terms of Orientalism, something that was, highly written about by Professor Edward Said and who's been mentioned a lot recently considering what is happening at Columbia University. But he, discussed how so many of these dynamics that we see in pop culture and media and the university setting as well has to do with this viewing the East through this lens of Orientalism, and how the West kind of portrays the East in this manner as people who need to be civilized, people who are barbaric, people who are exoticized in different ways, and in many ways are seen as less than human. And so these are the different lenses through which Palestinians are portrayed. And again, this is not something that is new. These examples are found throughout, modern history and portrayal of Palestinians. But obviously we see, escalation in the way this comes through, specifically when there are moments like the one that we're living through now, which is pretty much unprecedented in terms of the length of time that it's been covered in media and the extent of the physical brutality and destruction that's happening. So, we see in, the paradigms that are used to kind of dissect, the media coverage and what is happening in Gaza, and thinking about it in terms of things like apartheid and colonialism. We often see the story portrayed in terms of binaries. So again, the barbarian versus the civilized, or using the narrative of both sides. This is even relevant now in the way that college encampments are being covered when the pro-Palestinian students are being met with hostility both by police and by counter-protesters. It's often just talked about in terms of, well, they're both, squaring off and they're kind of dealing with hostility on both sides, but this is not an accurate portrayal of what is actually happening on these campuses. We also have, the use of passive language when talking about Palestinian death. So they have died versus being killed, and the use of such passive language in news articles and headlines and videos on TV, etc. Terms like conflict or clash, or even the framing of it as the Israel-Hamas war, when it's clearly a war on the Palestinian people. It's not a war with them. And so these distinctions in language are crucial in looking at how these dynamics are portrayed. we have the narrative of, Israel as the only quote unquote democracy in the Middle East versus the Palestinians who are seen as militant and radical and are portrayed by Netanyahu and others as equivalent to groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or others, when in reality, this is a complete misrepresentation of what the situation is. This myth of balance of, again, Israel being at war with Hamas ignores the element of the right of Palestinians to self-defense and instead focuses on Israel's right to self-defense, which is not necessarily a right for an occupier. So all of these elements serve to portray Palestinians as less than human, as people who are violent for no reason. And we have no context in a lot of the coverage as to why these things are happening. We've seen all kinds of statements made by American officials, Israeli officials that are completely racist in their nature. We've seen Netanyahu make a statement about this being a war between the children of light and the children of darkness. We've seen on politicians call for the complete obliteration of Palestinians, and using a lot of these myths that are, you know, disseminated about Palestinians to justify the murder of civilians, to damage to infrastructure, especially healthcare and educational institutions. They, claim to justify this on the basis of Palestinians using human shields and hiding in civilian areas and tunnels under hospitals and perpetuating false narratives like the beheaded babies narrative, and even the story by the New York Times on sexual violence, which has been largely debunked, and a lot of the sources and the author being called into question. And yet these things still remain in the discourse about what is happening, because once these things are thrown out there, it's very difficult, even though they have been debunked, to remove them from the public consciousness. And we've seen politicians, again, continue to make reference to these things. And so when you have these sorts of narratives that are constantly peddled about Palestinians, it becomes much easier to justify blowing up a hospital where, we've seen mass graves uncovered, more than 800 people being found in these mass graves, and in Nasser and Al-Shifa hospital. We've seen the targeting of intellectuals in Gaza, so professors, doctors, journalists, teachers, the actual human beings, in addition to the physical structures. Another topic that I think was touched on previously is this myth of objectivity when it comes to both academia and journalism, that, you can only be objective about a situation if you're white, essentially, if you're coming from this Eurocentric perspective. And so there is distrust and placed on Palestinian voices, that we can't necessarily trust these journalists who are on the ground. We can't necessarily trust Palestinian academics or others who are telling us what is happening, who are showing us what is happening, who are representing Palestinians on media. These people are being demonized as well, or again, their truthfulness or their reliability being called into question. And we've seen the connection with various Orientalist stereotypes. So there was an interview, I believe it was with Mustafa al-Barghouti, that he was being interviewed by a woman, and despite him trying to state his argument clearly, the interviewer kept saying, well, you're probably not used to women speaking, and things like that, basically indicating that, Muslim men or Palestinian men oppress women and do not allow them to have their own voices, etc. We have the burden being placed on Palestinian voices and allies to constantly condemn, condemn, condemn. And there is no opportunity to offer context for what is happening without first having this disclaimer. And it's very similar to the post 9/11 rhetoric that, you know, Muslims faced in terms of like, do you condemn, etc., without questioning more deeply, well, why did this happen? What in US foreign policy would lead to this sort of situation? And the same right now, without offering any context about Israeli apartheid and the occupation prior to October 7th, and the entire narrative being centered on October 7th. And so having traveled to Gaza prior to October 7th, this experience, you know, illustrated to me more than anything else the nature of Israeli apartheid and the nature of colonialism. And this is another term, that colonialism, that has been this sort of, you know, dirty word that Israel does not want to be associated with. And we've seen a pushback on the usage of this term recently in American media. But the fact of the reality is this is what is happening. Israel is a settler colonial state, and everything from the facts on the ground to the images to the videos to everything that we are bombarded with speaks to this narrative. The first time that I traveled to Palestine was to Gaza in 2010. And this was not too long after the siege had begun. And the situation was already horrible on the ground. You know, my family members are in refugee camps, and so they have been exiled from villages that were depopulated in 1948 to these refugee camps. And now they've been displaced some a second and third time from these refugee camps. And so in 2010, the situation was bad. In 2023, it was worse. And so I cannot even fathom what the situation, when this hopefully ends at some point in a ceasefire, how they can even begin to rebuild with the level of destruction that has happened there. Um, you know, traveling there in and of itself was a very harrowing, difficult experience. From the United States, you know, taking a plane to Cairo, and then going from Cairo to the Rafah crossing through multiple military checkpoints, through the Sinai Desert, through on a ferry, being stopped, being you know, searched, being asked for bribes along the way, the journey taking up to 8 hours, again, through the desert without making any stops for, you know, food or water or anything like that, not knowing if you're going to be turned back. And then once you arrive to the border, you're facing another 8 hours or so of waiting, of questions, of searches, etc. And this is, you know, from the Egyptian side, which is in collaboration with Israel. So there's no like, well, Israel withdrew from Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. No, they control everything on land, air, and sea. And so that journey took about 3 days. Imagine, with a family, with children, young children, older people, people who are ill. And now we have people who are going through that process in reverse, out of Gaza, trying to seek, you know, safety during a genocide. And they're not only going through the physical difficulties of it and the deprivation and the starvation and all of that, but also being, you know, forced to come forward with thousands of dollars in order to escape this genocide. So there are so many levels to the oppression, to the segregation, to the, you know, walling in of Palestinians and the deliberate separation of Palestinians from one another based on where they're from. So my family is actually from the West Bank. They're from a village in the West Bank. My husband is from Gaza. And so him having a Gaza Palestinian ID prevents him from visiting the West Bank. And I don't have a Palestinian ID because I was born in the United States, and my father was not able to get a Palestinian ID. Um, I'm going in as an American. And so our treatment, regardless of where we enter, is very, very different. Um, I have not been able to enter the West Bank. I'm not able to enter with my husband. He is not able to go there. My children are registered as having a father from Gaza, so I have not been able to try to go in with my children, but I don't know if that will be possible as well. And so I've actually never been to the village that my family is from because of all of these technicalities and these elements of separation due to where in Palestine we are from. I have family members who have one spouse that is from Gaza and one is from the West Bank, and they hold the IDs from each. And so neither one of them is able to visit where their spouse is from. And I have a family member that took up to 30 years to be able to get that permission. So this is something that affects Palestinians on a daily basis very deeply. The people that are living in Gaza, aside from, again, prior to October 7th, having at least in the summer when I was there, experiencing only 4 hours, 4 to 6 hours of electricity on a normal day, where the temperature is up to 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Very, very brutal conditions. And I can only imagine what that is like now in a tent that's made of vinyl, where people are essentially baking inside of them. It was extremely difficult to deal with that in an actual home. Again, in a refugee camp, under those conditions. So this is something that, the facts are there. It's very difficult, in my opinion, to deny any of this if you've actually seen it. And we've seen people have changed their perspective once they've actually visited either the West Bank or Gaza or both on the ground and seen it for themselves. Healthcare obviously is another issue that apartheid deeply affects. People are not able to go to different areas for, and again, we're talking prior to October 7th for medical treatment. You have to get permission, you have to file endless paperwork, you have to get permits to be able to exit, whether it's through Egypt or through the Erez border crossing, which now I don't even think is possible at all. But in order, again, prior to October 7th to get that, you would need all of that permission, which obviously could easily be denied. You need thousands of dollars, which most people do not have access to. And so all of this makes it nearly impossible for people to access medical treatment that's a matter of life and death. And we had people that were on lists waiting for exit to whether it was the West Bank or Egypt prior to October 7th. They had been waiting months and months in order to access that treatment. And then obviously they were not able to get that treatment, and many of them have died, whether it's from cancer, whether it's from lack of access to dialysis or other illnesses that they have not been able to seek treatment for. Now people have basically finished any supplies of medication they may have had, in correspondence with family members. They are despondent. There's no words that I can basically offer that can console somebody who is essentially waiting to either starve to death or die from lack of their medication. Um, it's a situation that I don't think our brains can fully grasp, that people are actually living through this right now. Children who are nursing, whose mothers cannot produce enough milk for them to survive because the mother is not eating enough calories a day in order to sustain that. Um, the only place of respite that I saw when I was there was the sea, and even the sea, it was patrolled by Israeli forces, and so Palestinians cannot go out to fish, further than a certain amount of kilometers. They are met with gunshots. They are met with violence if they are out too far. And so now they've even lost, that place of respite where they could at least go out and have some fresh air, in an area that, where they live is being extremely crowded and filled with people. Now they're crowded even further into, whether it's in Rafah or in other areas where people have been displaced. So there is so much about the system that is just strikingly parallel to, what history shows us regarding South Africa. And kind of the strange thing about it is when I was there in the summer, I was reading Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime, about growing up in South Africa. And I just was stunned by the parallels in his experience, and the things that he described, and what I was seeing around me. And it's actually very disheartening to see that he hasn't said anything about what is happening in Gaza, because the experience that he describes is strikingly parallel from, the lack of roads being cut off from one another, the lack of development in the areas where Black South Africans live versus white South Africans, the mention of being under oppression and being under apartheid, but yet within your personal areas in your domain, feeling like at least you had a sense of community, of support. And that is something that I felt in Gaza, which was that regardless of the brutality of apartheid and the occupation, at least they had one another and they had the ability in their communities to try to do whatever they could in order to survive, in order to try to make a life for themselves, to try to advance in whatever way possible with whatever meager resources that they had. um, and the ingenuity that these Palestinians had with literally nothing, and what they're able to accomplish, the drive that they have to learn and to attend university and to succeed and to envision a better future for their families is something that's so deeply inspiring. And so seeing now that these universities, that these institutions that they built with their blood, sweat, and tears, in order to try to envision that, um, is just so heartbreaking that students that were, a year away from graduating college or medical school or whatever it might be, now have their education stopped short. They don't know if they'll ever continue, and they don't know if it's even possible, right? That is if they're alive. And so the complete decimation of this entire society, of the system, of the education, of healthcare, is something that is very difficult to see and then have any sort of hope for the future moving forward. Um, but the one thing that does, inspire me and give me hope is something that I think our first speaker mentioned, was that these oppressive systems, they will eventually fall. They cannot sustain themselves. And I think that we're coming to that turning point where we see that Israel itself, I think, realizes that this is not sustainable. This is not something that can continue on in the way that it currently is. Will be replaced by something better is a question that he posed. And I don't know. I don't know if anyone can say what is happening in the future and where we'll end up. But I do believe that where we are right now, we cannot remain in this situation. There is no way that it's going to remain in the same form that we see it as now. And I hope that, with the growing movement, with the increase in the number of allies, with the strength of our youth, our college students who are standing and facing brutality from their universities and from the police, that, we will be able to envision a better way forward, and we will be able to see a Palestine that is free from apartheid, where people can live without occupation, and all people of all religions and ethnicities can have access to the same resources, to the land, to safety, and to healthcare and water and electricity and all of the things that, people deserve as, inhabitants of a land. Um, And I think, that's what the only thing that we can hope for moving forward. How it's going to happen, I think, we wait day by day and see how it develops. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deanna. I really appreciate your words today. I have a question here that I know you've just spoken to somewhat, but what factors might influence Palestine's trajectory post-liberation, and how might that path compare to South Africa's transition from apartheid to capitalism?
I mean, I think it really depends on the Palestinians themselves. I think it's difficult from the diaspora to kind of judge that, because it really is their right to self-determination and how, they decide to move forward as a nation. But I would hope that, we will take lessons from other liberation movements and other nations who have gone down this path, and, be aware of the challenges and of the difficulties that people face moving forward. But I don't know if I can necessarily give an answer to that myself.
Really appreciate that. And we want to thank you and all of our speakers for giving of your time, your energy, and your expertise for this event. And I know that using your knowledge and skills to spread the truth and to spread information is such a vital service. And we really can't thank you and Stephen and Peter John enough for being here today. So at this point, we are going to go to the Q&A. So we're going to open for some questions from the attendees. And if you can please type your questions in the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll take as many as we can with our limited time. We have about 20 minutes for questions or just under that. And as you're asking your questions, please just keep in mind our community guidelines. And I am going to hand it off to Maya to ask the first question.
Sure, thank you. And thanks again, Deanna. The first question I think is directed to Stephen. Someone wrote in the chat or in the Q&A that some people dispute the concept of Israeli apartheid, as they say that while South African apartheid and the racial discrimination that preceded it clearly was of economic benefit to white South Africa, as it enabled the extreme exploitation of Black people, the same is not true in Israel with respect to economic exploitation of Palestinian people. They argue that Israel does not have an economic imperative to oppress and exploit Palestinian people. To what extent is this true, and how can you respond to this?
I have two responses. I mean, the first one is that to say that there is, I'm not talking about motivations, but to say that there is no economic benefit is not accurate. Just to name one example, which is extremely important in the region, I mean, a great deal of work has been done on the expropriation of Palestinian water and water sources by the Israeli state, which turns out, in other words, that the Israeli state commandeers Palestinian water resources in a water-scarce region. So that is purely economic. Secondly, although, and I think that is, there is some important strategic concerns which flow from that. The Israeli state, excuse me, is not as dependent on the labor of Palestinians as the apartheid state was on the labor of Black people. I think that that is exaggerated to a certain extent. The events of since October the 7th have deprived some sections of the Israeli economy of Palestinian labor, which they need. So there are certain economic benefits. But even if there were no economic benefits, I'm not sure I understand the logic of saying something can't be apartheid if it doesn't have an economic benefit. I mean, if your motive is simply to believe that your group is superior to the other group, or your group is more deserving than the other group, which is the very least what the Israeli state is based on, and you pass laws and you build a political system based on that belief, you are practicing apartheid. the question of the economic implications and whether you benefit is secondary. Of course, the reality is, I mean, even taking away ignoring the point I made about the water, that there are economic benefits from ensuring that one group has privileges which others haven't. And, if you look at the 1948 borders of the Israeli state, and you look at the socioeconomic situation of Jewish Israelis and the socioeconomic situation of Palestinians, never mind the Palestinians who Diana was talking about, who live in refugee camps, but those who live within the 1948 borders, that on every measure, there's more Palestinian poverty, there's more Palestinian deprivation. So whether your motives are economic or not, by dominating another group in the way in which the Israeli state facilitates domination of Palestinians, you turn out to benefit economically from that as well.
Thank you. Deanna, please feel free to also respond.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that a bit. Theft of land in and of itself has economic motivation. You're literally stealing somebody's land, demolishing their house, and building something else on top of it. So, I mean, that's the entire basis of colonialism. Another industry that this is very apparent in is in produce, both in using Palestinian labor to harvest in very I don't even know the word to describe it, conditions basically akin to slave labor nearly, using child labor. This has been investigated, especially with regards to dates and date farms. And there have been numerous campaigns in the Muslim community during Ramadan where people buy a lot of dates regarding boycotting Israeli dates because they are both harvested from stolen Palestinian land, and the labor used to harvest is often child labor. And so it's not just dates, but other forms of produce. There's the theft of land where olive trees, lemon trees, orange orchards, all of these different produce items are either stolen, destroyed, or used illegally by Israeli settlers or forces. You also have the element of like tourism. So I'm sure many people saw the claims by Jared Kushner about building seaside property in Gaza and the motivation to do that sort of development and with obviously economic motivations. And it's especially painful to see that because the coast is the most beautiful part of Gaza, and the Palestinians themselves have not been allowed to develop that area, and whatever development that they have been able to achieve there has been destroyed. And so it was very jarring to see such a beautiful coastline and right across from it, refugee camps, the Shatit refugee camp. And so I, to myself, before any of this was thinking that if this was anywhere else in the world, this beautiful coastline, it would have been filled with, beautiful beaches and hotels and resorts and things like that. But Palestinians are prevented from developing it in that way, not only because of restrictions on the actual land itself, but the materials that they are allowed in to Gaza to facilitate building. So there are so many different dimensions that are preventing them from their own economic development. Not to mention them having to rebuild every few years because of Israeli bombing and assault in Gaza and in the West Bank due to home demolitions. So, I mean, you can go on and on about the economics of it, but I just wanted to mention those specific examples.
Yeah, I think that it's to restrict the apartheid to the economic dimension, which of course is one of the biggest and the most important dimensions of apartheid and the constructs that hold it up, is to forget that apartheid is an entire situation. So what we see happening in Israel, or on the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, and East Jerusalem and Gaza, the segregation, the residential segregation, all of those aspects that keep discrimination in place and that keep power relations skewed. That's also part of apartheid, and so it doesn't take away from the definition of apartheid just because one aspect is not as pronounced as the other.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those really insightful answers. We have a question for, I imagine, Peter John, which is, we spend a lot of time trying to resist the conflation of Judaism with Zionism by showing that many Jews are not Zionists. But the same point could be made by pointing to the fact that many Zionists are not Jewish. How do you understand Christian Zionism, and what role do you think it plays in Israeli apartheid?
Well, I think it's a huge support system for Jewish Zionism. The extent of Christian Zionism in the United States, in this country, in South Africa, is just huge. The perceived correct understanding of reading foundational texts in, say, the Christian community privileges an interpretation that equates ancient Israel with today's post-1948 boundaries. It equates notions of election as being privileging the original inhabitants. Now, all of that is roundly critiqued by contemporary theology and so forth, but within the mainstream Christian communities, it remains a default position, and so many of the parties contesting our elections later this month stand firmly with Israel because of the Christian Zionist influence, and so it plays a huge role, and it's one of our, I think, tasks is to deconstruct that, to help people read scriptures and the tradition very differently. But I think if you looked at the influence of the Bible Belt in the United States and its influence on elections and where and who those standing for election have to please and whose votes they have to court, you see the influence of it enormously all over. And I think it's one of the really big obstacles to creating even more solidarity with the Palestinian cause.
Thank you. We only have time, unfortunately, for one more question, but this can be directed to any of the panelists or all of you, depending on who wants to answer. So someone asked, what do you think is the best strategy to challenge powerful and loud voices like Dana Bash or New York Times that repeat and amplify biased talking points and Israeli propaganda within a facade of objective journalism? Is this a battle worth fighting, or should we focus first on the Jonathan Greenblatts?
So I think it is a battle worth fighting, but I think it's in context of all the other battles that we're fighting. And so we definitely need to push back against these narratives. It is very difficult because it is overwhelming, but I think that we are seeing some progress along those fronts. You may have one good story and 10 bad ones. You may have one good story and 20 bad ones, but at least we're getting some good stories out there and some positive coverage, whereas in the past it was nearly zero. We are able to make more progress due to social media, and I think that especially TikTok has really changed the way that people view these mainstream voices and how they've come to challenge them. And so we are seeing, people who are taking these, statements that come from mainstream media outlets and dissecting them, whether it's through TikToks, whether it's through Instagram posts or any other forms of analysis through social media, and these posts are going viral. And so, yes, it may not impact the larger structure of mainstream media, but it is allowing people to question what they're being told. It is leading people to realize that media literacy is such an important skill, and not necessarily just believing everything that you watch or are told from the mainstream. Another thing that's important is sort of developing alternative outlets and independent media and trying to amplify those voices to counter, again, the mainstream voices. There are those who will always call into question the objectivity of Palestinian voices and denounce them, but those voices are being amplified now more than ever. So we've seen that with people like Mataz Azaiza and Bisan Al-Auda and Plastia and others whose voices have come out of Gaza, and they've gained, up to 1 million followers. And so, yes, it may not be going head to head with the New York Times or CNN, but it's definitely making an impact in terms of the American public, especially the younger generations. And so I think it is, a battle worth fighting in terms of having our voices heard, sending in emails, critiquing coverage, making phone calls, letting these newsrooms hear our perspective, because when they are getting pro-Palestinian voices on those outlets, they are definitely hearing from Zionists that are complaining about those perspectives. So we have to both do our part in thanking for having Palestinian or allied voices support the cause, and also voicing our critique when there are narratives that need to be challenged.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm a bit puzzled that there should be an either or here. Why does one have to choose between tackling Diana Bash and CNN and Greenblatt? It seems to me that it's very important that, the point I was trying to make is, behind both of them, the one represents a so-called Jewish organization, the other one doesn't, but behind both of them is a Western supremacist, white supremacist account, and we've surely challenged both. And they're probably related in the sense that, as Diana implied towards the end, one of the reasons why people like Diana Bash where she was is because of the constant lobbying of people like Jonathan Greenblatt. So, it seems to me that, our collective attention span should be sufficient to deal with both of those. And I think it's very important to see this, as I think the students who are demonstrating in the US are seeing it. This is not, yes, it's about Jews and it's about Zionism, it's about Palestinians, but a lot of it is just about these constant Western attitudes of white supremacy, which obviously are to be found in the media, in politics, and everywhere else. So I really don't think it's an either or, and I think it's important to challenge all of them.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that I find, and I don't know what the correct word is, if it's heartening, if it's challenging, is that the Palestinian struggle has ignited a consciousness in many people of injustices elsewhere. It seems to have foregrounded the multiplicity of injustices that hold up so many of our societies. And I hear constantly of people who are have been inspired by this struggle to stand up, to march, to do things, but saying we've also got to do something about things at home. We've got to do something about the DRC Congo, the DR Congo. We've got to do something about Sudan, and we can't do everything, but there are other things we can do. And so the courage and the anger and the hope that all lie tangled in the Palestinian struggle is also feeding into other struggles and feeding into other people's reawakening of their political consciousness. People are reading again. You know, so many people. I asked a lady at a bookshop the other day, and she said, "Oh, are you going to ask me for another Ilan Papa?" So you know, people are reading, and that must be one of the signs of hope. And so I just want to encourage us to also broaden our solidarity.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way to end. Just to end on that note of hope. So with that, I want to thank, on behalf of IfNotNow and SAJFP, our speakers again for your incredible insights, your time, and your work. If you didn't get a chance to ask your questions, those who have submitted questions, please don't worry. We would like to invite everyone here to a follow-up facilitated conversation to further discuss the information that was raised during this event and to further plug in if you would like to be part of ongoing work related to this. The details for the follow-up will be 1 week from today. So that's Sunday, May the 12th at 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. PDT and 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. South Africa time. And I will now let you take a look at the social media pages for our respective organizations if you would like to reach out or follow our pages. And again, thank you to everyone who came today. This conversation needs to, of course, continue. There's so much more to still learn and discuss, but we look forward to continuing this next week with whoever wants to join. And thanks again to everyone. Have a good day or night further, depending on where you're joining us from.